Bob is a combined diplomacy with an intellectual pursuit to become one of Australia's most distinguished scholar of Middle Eastern studies. And he has not only enriched our center and the ANU, but also many organizations outside the ANU. And he's one of the very few public servants who has maintained a very keen interest in promoting knowledge about the Middle East, and well after his retirement. He's author of numerous works on the Middle East. His latest book, which only came out last year, was on a subject of political and social change, the case of Egypt in the Middle East. And of course, it couldn't really come out more timely. Bob did not predict the Egyptian revolution, or for that matter, the Jasmine revolution in Tunisia, but nor did many other specialists of Middle Eastern studies. But Bob did point out in his book the challenges that the Arab world was going to face. And if they don't overcome these challenges, then the likelihood was that the region will experience turbulence and turmoil in the long run. I can go on and take up more of your time to talk about Bob's other contributions, but I think I will save that for another time. And tonight it is a great honor to have him here to speak on the topic of Egypt and the politics of change in the Arab world. And of course, as I pointed out, I don't think there is a more suitable person to speak on this topic than Bob, who has certainly distinguished himself as both a diplomat and a scholar. And may I also say that in the last 3 weeks he's become a media star, but a very reluctant media star. I've been trying to encourage him and gently pressure him, and I'm not the sort of person to pressure anybody, to become more proactive in terms of enlightening the public about the Middle East and providing them with the valuable insight that he has. Of course, he resisted for a long time, but I'm so pleased that he finally decided to come out, particularly in the last 3 weeks. And he's given more interviews. Is it 3 weeks or 4 weeks? 3 or 4 weeks. But he's given more interviews than perhaps any other specialist on the subject in the last few weeks. And may I present to you Professor Robert Bowker. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm in for that very generous introduction. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill once saying that having heard an introduction like that, he could hardly wait to hear himself speak. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Neil Truscott, a former Australian ambassador who served with distinction in Iraq, Lebanon and Syria. Neil was a great supporter of Australian engagement with the Arab world and a friend of the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies and the ANU. This is an opportunity to present some personal reflections on what, after nearly 40 years of working in and on the region, I regard as the most significant moment in the modern history of the Arab world. Why do I make that observation? I think there are 4 core reasons. The first is that for the first time in the past 60 years, a secular political force has emerged in the heart of the Arab world, Ummadaniya, capable of capturing the political imagination of the emerging Arab middle class. It is inclusive of all political forces, not only of the Islamists. It is non-violent, but it is determined. It is technologically sophisticated, and it is globally connected. Secondly, it is a positive development. The events of 1948, the wars of 1967 and 73, the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the Iraq War itself were tragedies. The uprising in Egypt in 2011, by contrast, addresses for the first time the needs of the Arab world as identified by Arab intellectuals themselves since 2002. Those intellectuals pointed, in a series of publications known as the Arab Human Development Reports and elsewhere, to the need to reform the institutions of the Arab state if the gaps between the achievements of the Arab world and other developed countries were to be closed. The first steps have now been taken in that process. Thirdly, it is a process of empowerment, which is more important than any single event or outcome. It is a reflection of systemic changes that cannot be reversed. Demographic changes, increased performance in terms of education, health factors, the internet, the social networking, the mobile phone with a camera, which is the Kalashnikov of the 21st century. It is a result of the removal of barriers of fear and political resignation. Fourth and finally, this is not the gift of foreigners. The United States was right to let the political process in Egypt take its course, while keeping intact its relations with the Egyptian military, which was the only constant in the evolving political situation in Cairo. Intervention by the United States would have been disempowering and likely to cause a negative popular reaction in Egypt and elsewhere. It would have had unpredictable consequences, raising in many minds the fear of what took place during the past decade in Iraq. Now there are organic connections between Egyptian society and the political reform process, together with a degree of US influence over that process that could prove critical to its eventual direction. There is a long way to go. This is a moment of enthusiasm and gloom, of courage and fear, which has transformed the political debate in the Arab world. It presents a future that is pregnant with possibilities. The military in Egypt will not hand over power to a vacuum or institutions which promise to threaten their values and their considerable economic and other interests. They will not tolerate an outcome which places the political future of Egypt in the hands of the Islamists, against whose values and activities they have been struggling since the 1950s. The current situation has certain parallels to Turkey until 15 years ago, in which the Turkish military continued to regard itself as having a duty to protect the secular character of the state. Egyptian political culture at present is closer to the political environment of Turkey at that time than to the Turkey of today. But as Turkey evolved politically, so too eventually will Egypt. The Egyptian military is not immune from the changes that have taken place in the Egyptian society over the past 30 years. It is more professional and it wants to be respected at home and abroad. But there are questions to be answered about whether the military will be cohesive in its approach. It has significant commercial interests and it will not be willing to face probes regarding corruption. Although some of its elements might be tempted, I doubt that the Egyptian military would be inclined to seek a reversion to a clearly failed state-based economic model. And I think the United States would make it clear that it would not support such a change. The greater risk is that the incoming Egyptian government will be tempted to succumb to popular pressures to move towards sustaining and increasing subsidies on consumer goods, fuel, bread, cooking oil and the like, rather than targeting that support so that it assists the most vulnerable parts of the Egyptian society. Negotiation of the political transition in Egypt will be extended. People are impatient for change, but the institutional gaps to be filled on the secular side of Egyptian politics are formidably large. The current concern is not that the military will be too slow to hand over political power to civilians, but rather that it may do so too quickly. Progress toward social, economic and political empowerment of women, and today I remind you is the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day, will remain uneven. There are going to be arguments about the elements of the new constitution, for example over human rights and religious freedoms. What will be done about the defence of heavenly religions? Criticism of a heavenly religion is a criminal offence in Egypt under the current arrangements. What will be done about the status of Baha'is? And what we do about the emerging issue of evangelical Christians in Egypt. The secular side of Egyptian politics has seen the potential to bring about change through its inclusive approach. Tensions and gaps between Muslims and Christians have also been reduced by the shared experiences of both of those during past months. Amr Moussa, the Secretary General of the Arab League, is polling strongly as a possible secular national presidential candidate capable of attracting widespread popular support. But beyond the presidential level, the secular side of Egyptian politics may not provide a credible alternative to the Islamist stream. Core support for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is probably somewhere around 20 to 30%, may translate into significantly increased parliamentary representation for Islamists in general, especially if the electoral system does not change to some form of proportional representation. It also remains to be seen whether the secular parties can be reformed or created to be a viable alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood and its political affiliates. And a political mobilisation of Coptic Christian Egyptians may galvanise and produce negative responses from among some Islamist groups. For now, Islamists have been left at the rear of the vanguard. They may find it hard to move to the front. Islamists will face intense internal debates as pressure to take clear positions increases. They will face risks of division along reformist and conservative lines within the Brotherhood itself, including the possible establishment of the long-awaited Wasit Party, a reformist-minded breakaway group from the Brotherhood itself. And in seeking to become more directly involved in an open political system, the Islamists will face the likelihood of divisions appearing within their ranks about the inevitable compromises over questions concerning their core values. I see the eventual participation of a range of Islamist parties in coalition building as more likely than a single party linked to the Muslim Brotherhood or an Egyptian equivalent of Turkey's AKP party securing a parliamentary majority in its own right. And in the meantime, challenges from Islamist youth, the blogger phenomenon, to establishment figures within the Muslim Brotherhood leadership will continue. We will hear alternative voices to the Brotherhood, some of which, such as Amr Khalid, we might welcome, and some of which, the pietist Salafist stream within Egypt, we probably will not. The key question in all of this is, how does one bring about systemic reform instead of breakdown in societies in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world that are increasingly demanding change, but which are both authoritarian and chaotic? The tectonic plates of Arab society have shifted. The rivets have popped in some cases, but the Titanic took a long time to sink. Not long enough if you're a passenger, probably about 30 minutes too long if you're watching the movie. But opposition movements have demonstrated an ability to bring down governments without demonstrating that they are yet in a position to rule. What does the future hold? The Chinese statesman Zhou Enlai, when asked for his opinion of the French Revolution, famously replied that it was too soon to tell. That's no less true of the current situation in the Arab world. Achieving systemic change is more than a matter of elections. It goes to the core of national values, reflected and reinforced in families, in education, in politics and in business. It relies not only upon the rhetoric of leadership, but upon role models of leadership in households, in schools, in police forces and in political institutions as well. The rate of change in social values is going to be slower than changes in the political sphere. Society is changing as indicators of social development, from literacy to birth control to ages upon marriage, all attest. But depending on socio-economic and educational levels, traditional values in Arab societies will adapt only gradually to new realities. There can be no doubt, however, that the political agenda of the Arab world, from Morocco to Oman, is now focused on empowerment. That demand is the yeast in a fermenting brew of structural issues that will not go away. They are the forces that are driving change. It has added a new and powerful dimension to the desire, growing stronger over the past decade, to be both modern and Arab. It is now recognised to be the indispensable pathway to closing the gaps, as identified by Arabs themselves, between the Arab world and other developed countries. On the outcome of the search by Egyptians for a meaningful voice in decisions affecting their lives hangs the future direction of the Arab world. Success in Egypt, even if it is not immediately replicated elsewhere, will shape Arab political culture for generations to come. It will help address the symptoms of disempowerment and the erosion of belief in one's individual worth that have so badly damaged the fabric of Egyptian society. From abrogation of human rights to the harassment of women to systemic corruption and abuses of power, all too common under the Mubarak regime. Failure to surmount the pathology of authoritarianism in the Arab world will be certain to rebound to the advantage of those whose social and political values are regressive. It is a recipe for despair and all that could follow from it. I believe reform is inescapable because the alternatives are worse. Turning to regional security, when considering the strategic implications of these developments, I see more positives than negatives that may be identified from an Australian or a Western perspective. And I'll mention two of these here. Firstly, security in the Middle East is conditioned not only by the structure of the regional system and the interaction of states, but also by the domestic characteristics of those states. In other words, the relationship between governing institutions and popular audiences. Security is more than the achievement of certain levels of military capability and the resolution of political differences. Leaders also have to win acceptance of those outcomes. As the American writer David Shipler once said, whatever happens in war or diplomacy, whatever territory is won or lost, whatever accommodations or compromises are finally made, the future guarantees that Arabs and Jews will remain close neighbours in a weary land, entangled in each other's fears. They will not escape from one another. They will not find peace in treaties or in victories. They will find it, if they find it at all, by looking into each other's eyes. The Palestinian issue is a human and political tragedy, but the conflict with Israel also served as a fixative for the old Arab order. It provided an outlet for frustration over a range of domestic issues that could not be expressed directly at the regimes themselves. And it helped sustain simplistic notions about the reasons for the Arab world falling behind other developed countries. There were legitimate grievances and concerns on both sides of the conflict as well, of course. But popular disempowerment added to the mythologies of the Palestinian issue and at times the rhetoric of armed struggle. All too often, disastrous consequences for the Arab world followed. Empowerment of Arab audiences is a first step toward building durable relations between stable and self-confident Arab regimes and Israel. There will be debate, and there should be debate, about the quality of relationship Arab states should have with Israel while the Palestinian issue and other areas of dispute remain unresolved. But there is less likely now to be a sullen acceptance of leadership decisions in which popular opinion has played no part, and on which no security for Israel or for any other state in the region could be built. We are already seeing the familiar public rhetoric of the Arab League about upholding Arab unity and sovereignty becoming harder to sell to Arab audiences. Those audiences are demanding that their own leaders be held accountable. They are not looking for excuses for inaction in the face of human rights and other abuses and failures of the Arab system. Looking some years ahead, and I am genuinely looking some years down the track, I believe an informed popular appreciation of national interest in peace, stability and predictability in dealings between Arab states and Israel will be likely to prevail. An increasingly well-educated and sophisticated Arab public can be expected to take a more nationalistic but less ideological view of their own interests among pan-Arab and Islamic causes. When it comes to Israel, there'll be plenty of sound and fury, and perhaps some gratifying but largely inconsequential political gestures underlining the depth of popular feelings. But peace between Egypt and Israel will continue. It is the bedrock of regional security and progress. It serves the interests, cautiously calculated and pragmatically pursued, of both sides. Secondly, the Arab revolutions, if they continue to be based on inclusive approaches to dealing with political and social issues, are a major victory for the progressive values that we support. They offer empowerment and they offer hope. And by doing so, they underline the bankruptcy of Al-Qaeda's jihadist rhetoric. They offer a more attractive set of values to the Arab middle class than the brutally repressive and sterile politics of the Iranian model, or the hard-edged confrontational politics and the carefully staged-managed anger of Hezbollah. The support consistently expressed in Arab opinion polls for political figures opposed to the United States reflected more than the rejection of certain US policies and distress at the gaps between its values and its behaviour. Alongside those factors, which are real factors, were issues of fear and disempowerment and popular frustration with Arab regimes. The United States will not enjoy the unquestioning support of its Arab friends, and the extent of that support is often overstated. I remember one American ambassador in the middle of a particular crisis telling me that if he had faithfully reported back to Washington everything that was being told to him in the palace, Congress would not only have broken relations, it would have declared war. But we are now seeing the possibility that the policies of the United States and the quality of its leadership are more likely to be evaluated on their own merits. Progressive Arab governments, be they secular or Islamist in character, will make decisions based on national interest. More consultative dealings with domestic political audiences, and the US and others' diplomacy and powers of persuasion. It will be a more complex, less predictable, more challenging regional picture. But it is the only one which is consistent with the levels of political freedom, educational progress, economic sophistication and other values that we wish the people of the Arab world to enjoy. To conclude, I have argued in this lecture that the implications of the situation unfolding in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world are central to the future of the Arab political order. Its consequences are difficult, if not impossible, to predict with any confidence. For the first time, a secular but inclusive political alternative to neo-traditional Islamism has emerged. It has captured the political imagination of the emerging Arab middle class. It will shape the regional security environment. But the greatest risk to the region is the marginalisation and the alienation of a movement that has now raised its political horizons. Regimes that fail to address effectively the demands for empowerment of its educated youth face the prospect of a tsunami-like current of instability and regression. Like the Arab countries now seeking a way forward, we need to avoid overemphasising the romance of the revolution. We must be aware of the poetic power of the political mythologies when analysing the hard and the mundane realities of transition that lie ahead. Western countries must not lose interest in the transition process, from authoritarianism to successful democratic empowerment. If we, Australia, are to be part of the shaping of the values of the Arab world, it is essential to engage with respect for their own priorities as they see them with the emerging forces of Arab political, business and civil society. It is the process of change that matters here, rather than the key outcomes or the positive or negative developments in particular countries at any given time. But nor should we overlook or fail to celebrate what is by any measure a unique historical moment for the Arab world. I recently wrote an obituary of Neil Truscott, reflecting on the distinguished part he played in developing Australia's early diplomatic presence in the Middle East. But Neil had also once said, with typically disarming frankness, that as a very young diplomat, I think he was 21 at the time, posted to Washington in the 1940s, he was largely unaware of the global significance of many of the developments going on around him. No one who aspires to a career in international relations or in Australia's dealings with the Middle East should have to say the same thing about what we are now witnessing. For my generation, certain historical events will always stand out. Landing on the moon, the fall of the Berlin Wall among them. But for someone who has seen all too much sadness and frustration of progress toward the Arab world enjoying the respect that it deserves, the events of 2011 have particular poignancy. Nasser, in 1952, finally secured for Egypt the end of the values and the institutions and the constraints of Egypt's colonial period. But Nasser and his successors left ordinary Egyptians without a political voice. Now, for the first time in 2,500 years, an Egyptian standing in the heart of the Arab world has been able to say, "Egyptians, hold your heads high, for we are free." The Arab future is now in the hands of its own people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for those very enriching and valuable insights. I think one of the important points that you made, that the situation is impregnant with many opportunities. And as you concluded your remarks, this is probably the first time that the Arab peoples have an opportunity since the fall of Baghdad in 1258, when it was the glorious capital of the Abbasid Empire. The Arab peoples have the opportunity to determine their own future, rather than the future being determined by decisions made either in the capital of the Ottoman Empire, or in Paris, or in London, or for that matter in Washington. And I think the world powers, more importantly the United States, will do best now to let this enterprise be an Arab enterprise and not to be seized as something which they could possibly shape. And I thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Bob has kindly agreed to take a number of questions, and would you kindly identify yourself and ask the question. Please make sure to keep your questions short, and Bob reciprocate by making his responses as short as possible.
Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate very much your valuable opinions we heard today, and also your valuable opinions we read in your last book about Egypt and the Arab world. Before my question, I would like to say a few remarks, if you allow me. I think this is, by any definition, what's happened in Egypt. It's a revolution. It's a real revolution, and for the first time in the Egyptian history, made by the people and led by the young generations. The spark came from the young generations, actually. But all the people joined this revolution. And if you make a comparison about what's happened now and what's happened in 1952, actually in 1952 it was a military coup d'etat supported by the people. But what's happened in 2011, it's people revolution supported by the military. I'm not worried about the Islamist trends, and because as we have seen in the revolution that all the people, rich, with the poor, Muslim, with Copt, men and women, all went to the streets aspiring toward democratically elected government, better Egypt, better life, civil state based on justice and respecting human rights. And we didn't notice any sort of religious slogans. I could say, I don't know if you agree with me or not, one of the big losers from what's happened in Egypt after the former regime, the former president, the Muslim Brotherhood, because they lost some of their credibility, because they declared before the 25th of January that they will not join these demonstrations and they will boycott it. And really they didn't join. But when it was shown that it was a success, later on they joined it. And sometimes they tried to raise some religious slogans, but the others were very careful about it, and they stopped and they accepted it. So I'm not worried about it. The former regime was trying to frighten the United States and the West, and even the secular people inside Egypt, Copts especially, that the choice is between two alternatives only: Muslim Brotherhood or the current regime. But it's not true. And they tried to weaken all the opposition parties, and they strengthened the Muslim Brotherhood and tried to use it as a pretext to keep the power. Also, I'm not worried about the military. That some they are worried about that the military will stay in power, and will repeat the same story of what happened in 1952. I don't know. I'm not worried about it because time is totally changed, and the guarantee is the people themselves. They will not accept to repeat. What has happened on the 25th of January is irreversible. We will not accept to repeat what's happened before 25th of January. For the foreign policy, you can see that the agenda of this revolution is internal agenda. Nothing, it has nothing to do with the foreign policy. It has nothing to do with Israel or United States. Nobody criticizes the policy of the United States or Israel or normalization with Israel. And even the only statement from the Supreme Military Council came that they will respect all the commitments and the treaties made by the former government, and all the people totally agree with this trend. So I'm not worried about it. But of course, I have to say that to achieve the democratic state and the democratic transition, it's a long process. We still have a lot of challenges. We still have a lot of obstacles. We have had only a good start, but it takes time. And of course, we need the support of the international community to achieve our goals, which will take, I think, some time. My question is, from your experience as ambassador of Australia to Egypt, did you expect what's happened? What were your expectations exactly from your experience?
Thank you, Ambassador. To answer the question first and then perhaps to respond to your comments, I was not anticipating that 2011 would be the year in which the dam broke. I was certainly conscious that the pressures for change were building up, but I was more focused on the question of whether the leadership in Egypt could recognise that need for change and move forward than I was anticipating the sudden collapse of the system. And I think that the events in Tunisia took the region by surprise because we hadn't understood quite how high not only the level of frustration was, but how high the organisational capability of young Arabs had developed over the past couple of decades. That was the area where we had not understood, and there'd been contradictory signals. In fact, just before I left Cairo, there were some attempts on Facebook to rally people for demonstrations and so on, and hardly anybody turned up. Something happened in the intervening period, which obviously changed that picture. But Ambassador, on your overall comments, which I fully share, I personally believe that we are going to see a coalition building process as the natural outcome of empowerment in Egypt. Empowerment will produce divisions within the Islamist side of the spectrum and, of course, inevitably on the secular side. And this is a healthy development, it is a normal development. It is one which I think should reduce concerns that any single aspect, any single element within the Egyptian system will become a dominant and exclusive element within that system. I'm also delighted that Copts and Muslims shared the experience of the revolution because they have found a great deal of what they have in common that had been lost in people's day-to-day experience over the last decade or so. It has been a remarkable contribution to civic culture, to political culture, as well as to people's sense of empowerment within the Egyptian system. What we are seeing is a contest between generations now. A contest between those who were pressing for reform within secular circles and those who were pressing for reform within the Muslim Brotherhood itself, butting up against the forces on the secular side and on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood who were reluctant to see change come about. And that will remain a contest between younger and older, privileged and non-privileged. But as this process works its way through, young Islamists and young secular activists will continue to find what they have in common in trying to move Egypt forward into a progressive, dynamic state and releasing the energy and the intellectual abilities of Egyptians.
Thank you. We'll go there.
Yes, Peter Callum, I'm with the WASP because forgive my ignorance on Egypt generally, but I'd like you, if you could, Professor Bowker, to tell us a little bit about the economic forces and economic circumstances, both internal and external, and whether or not these are going to be helpful, or perhaps not so helpful, in helping Egyptians realize their economic ambitions, not just their political and social ambitions.
One of the very interesting drivers of change in Egyptian society has been the shift from a state-dominated economy to an economy increasingly dominated by the private sector, partly as a result of the ending of state ownership of certain enterprises, partly because of foreign direct investment into the economy. The combination of Gulf funds, modern technology and Egyptian inputs from an increasingly well-educated youth and so on. But given the disempowering effects of the Egyptian system on ordinary Egyptians, the sort of values that were being produced in that private sector economy were not readily translated into changes of values at the political level or indeed at the societal level. And I used to wonder, after visiting companies such as, telling tales out of school if I've named them, but I would go to visit certain companies owned by Egyptians but part of a global network, and look at these bright young Egyptians working as engineers or whatever, with the corporate values of the company displayed around the cafeteria wall, and talking about peer review of performance and other totally non-traditional notions of best practice, and wonder what happened when they turned off the light and went home. What sort of impact was this going to have on families, on image of the family, and all these sorts of questions? Well, now that the political system has suddenly been cracked open, those sorts of values are much more likely to take genuine root in Egyptian society. Because if there is one thing that I have found young Egyptians have in common, it is that they all wish to be both Arab, Muslim in the case of Muslims, and modern, and to be respected for being modern. And that is, I think, the value that the economy will increasingly generate.
Yes.
Thanks, Marash, Marzaid as well. The question is, during this transition period of Egypt at the moment, what is the role of Australia, the United States and Europe? My question is, the Western world can contribute towards Egypt. I guess in the case of Iraq, the United States were already on the field itself, whereas we were outside. What is our role can be from outside?
I think given the political circumstances of Egypt at this moment, when we're at least 6 months and possibly a year from seeing the shape of the new political configuration, who will have power, what their ideological orientation will be, the relationship between the civil and the military side of the political spectrums, whether the inclusive approach to political party organisation and so on can be sustained. All those questions are still out there to be addressed, and it's really too soon to be saying what Australia could be doing. But I'd suggest a couple of things that are going to be important. The first is that we ask Egyptians what their priorities are, and make our own informed decision about whether those priorities are priorities we can assist them with. It would be disempowering, it would be offensive for Australians to go to Egypt and start telling Egypt what its solutions might look like. Secondly, I think it's important for us not to be dragged into a situation of supporting recurrent Egyptian budget deficits. We don't have the strategic interests of the Europeans or the Americans in providing that level of support. We don't have the resources or the priority to give to that sort of support. I think we will be looking at much more modest approaches, hopefully which target the needs of women and which seek to provide innovative ways of changing the economic circumstances of women who wish to be entrepreneurs or who wish to take part in some way in supporting their families without being dependent upon the male dominated aspects of village society or the business community more generally. There's probably a place also for assisting Egyptian banking in understanding the management of credit and the assessment of risk. Because traditionally Egyptian banks have worked for the state and to the state and have not developed the body of expertise in those sorts of areas that a young entrepreneur who wants to create a business needs to find in the banking system.
Thanks, Bob, for a very generous and great expertise, bringing your expertise to this issue. I suppose it'd be remiss of me on the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day to follow up on that very point. And one of the things that I'm an ex-out AusAid, so maybe it's an AusAid infiltrated sort of approach to development. But do you see, in the sense of the women having the opportunities to be empowered, things like the Green Bank at that sort of micro or quite ground level, if you like, providing funds as a very practical way of sparking and generating that form of economic and social change?
The work that has been done on microcredit, microfinancing arrangements in Egypt, especially in Upper Egypt, has indicated there is some real potential there. It's not without problems, because as women have found their situation to be more robust, if you like, in dealing with those around them, much of the male reaction has been negative. But there is, I think, a lot of scope for doing that. One of my fondest memories, in fact, was not in Egypt but in Gaza, when I was working with the UN, and the agency that I was working for, as usual, was running out of money, and so to help us along, the good citizens of Gaza decided to have a demonstration outside UNRWA headquarters. And as I stood there looking out my window, and the rocks and the bottles were coming over the wall, normal situation, I looked out, and there were the ladies from my micro enterprise program selling soft drinks to the crowd. It pays to be creative.
Yes, we'll go there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kieran. I'm just started university here, doing economics at the moment. I have a personal interest in politics and all that. What I wanted to ask is, when President Obama was elected, there was this sense of change and reform in America. And I guess everyone around the world kind of saw that our view of America had kind of changed. And what I want to know is that with all this reform and change occurring in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, do you think that the Obama administration has taken the appropriate measures and has done kind of the right thing? Like, what do you think, what is your assessment of their actions?
I think the Obama administration has closed the gap between expectations that were created, and in fact initially before the Obama administration, when Condi Rice addressed an audience in Cairo, but then when Obama himself went to Egypt to deliver a landmark speech on US relations with the Muslim world, there was a genuine expectation then that the United States was going to take a much more robust approach on issues to do with the Palestinians and also on democracy. Well, on the Palestinian front, I think disappointment remains. Indeed, if anything, in the last few weeks, disappointment has risen with the US approach. But on the issue of democracy, I think that Obama has played a very difficult hand, as well as it could have been played under the circumstances. And certainly, as I said early in the speech, the management of that relationship with the element that proved to be the ultimate source of resolution of the question of whether Mubarak should stay or go has been very effective, and it will place the Americans in a position to shape the views and the approaches of the Egyptian armed forces better than would have been the case if they had followed the advice of the commentariat and proceeded to threaten the military with withdrawal of funding, support and so on. It's always in the Middle East, or usually in the Middle East, a choice between bad and worse. I think the Americans probably chose, in difficult circumstances, an approach that will prove to be the best they could have had under the circumstances.
Thank you, Dr. Bowker. I just want to say, many of my relatives in Alexandria, Egypt, have spoken to. There's a euphoria in the air, and it's hard to sort of distinguish between how much is that is going well and not. But now there's also been a call-up, basically to the Egyptian diaspora around the world, and Australians of Egyptian heritage, such as myself, to come back and rebuild the country, which, to be frank, I don't know what they mean by rebuilding. It's not like it's a broken area, but basically I think they mean civil society and so forth. And so the question I want to ask is, are the structures in place in Egypt? It is a field I want to get into in terms of building civil society, democracy promotion and so forth. And given, I don't know, historical precedents and so forth, how long does a democratic transition take? And it's a very vague question. So how do you answer that?
I'm measuring my piece of string as we talk. I think that the comment I'd make is that there is certainly enormous scope for Egyptians who have gained business experience, professional experience outside Egypt, be it in the Gulf or be it in Western countries, to go back and contribute to the development of an economy in Egypt that is going to close the gaps with the developed world. One of the most remarkable success stories in that respect, in fact, is from a gentleman who was born in Alexandria, graduated from university there and then moved to Australia, who returned to Egypt a decade ago to establish the first modern gold mine in Egypt, which is now a major contribution to Egypt's economic outlook, because there'll be many more following his example. But there's always been a movement of people and ideas between Egypt and the Gulf, and a lot depends on whether those who come back find that the economy actually has some traction. At the moment its wheels are spinning. They will want to feel that their voices are being heard in political decision making, but above all else they are going to want transparency in decisions of government, whether it's in regard to their investment or their personal status and so on. And that is something which only the Egyptian system can address. Outsiders can have no impact on how soon Egyptians want to put those structures in place. I'm an optimist on that score, but how long it will take, it depends on how many Egyptians come back demanding an opportunity to help.
In terms of diffusion of this tsunami of democracy rise in the Middle East, Egypt and elsewhere, how do you see this progressing to Saudi Arabia? And if it happens there, what would be the role of the international community if the regime is going to collapse?
Every Arab regime has significant differences one from another. They also have certain common problems. Graduate unemployment, prominent among them, sense of frustration with the absence of a voice in decisions that affect them as individuals, individuals within the system and so on. But in the case of Saudi, as is the case with many of the Gulf states, calls for reform are going to get entangled with other issues about in the case of Saudi, the authority of the Sunni and the House of Saud on the one hand, and the Shia minority on the other. The question of where does religion fit within the values of a reforming Saudi Arabia and so on. And I don't get the impression that the Saudis will fail to deal with those problems well short of encountering a violent political upheaval. It depends on personalities, the reformist orientation not only of the monarch, which in the case of Abdullah has been very strong, but those perhaps of the generation that follows the current leadership. And whether they, like most of the Gulf Arab leaderships, have that same desire to be respected for the modernising activity of the House of Saud itself. I'm an optimist about Saudi, and I think that it is, while certainly there are challenges there, it's easy to overstate the level of mobilisation of the Shia against the regime. The Shia have long been asking for respect, for a greater recognition of their voice, but they've been very careful also not to engage in a confrontation over those issues. That could change, of course, but my sense is that it's a manageable transition process that we're looking at, with the House of Saud looking pretty much the same 5 years from now.
We'll make the two last questions there.
Thank you very much.
Man over there.
It's wonderful, Professor, to listen once again to Bob. I did for 4 years as his Irish colleague in Cairo, and the clarity that we saw this evening was always the clarity that his colleagues in the diplomatic corps in Cairo benefited from during his time. Bob, I think most of the conversation, the dialogue, has focused on internally. It's been about what will happen internally in Egypt. I wondered if I could tempt you to go beyond for a moment the borders of Egypt, because, you know, as you said at the beginning, I think quite rightly, something dramatically new has happened. There is something new in the air, not only in Egypt but across the Middle East, North Africa. And that new atmosphere will affect 1 out of every 5 women and men who walk on the Arab street, because 1 out of every 5 happens to be Egyptian. It will affect the Arab League. More accountability, democratisation being an absolute demand of a young, now demanding to be empowered people, young people. That will change the Arab League. How do you, I mean, I know that you, by disposition, I suppose all diplomats by disposition are optimists, but how do you, by disposition, how do you, are there any thoughts, any reflections you have on that new dynamic, the new dynamic within the Arab street? Because while the ambassador, I totally agree with him, is absolutely right in identifying the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood had no monopoly of feeling an attitude towards the Palestinians. That was an attitude right across the Arab street. Arabs felt a deep sense of solidarity for their Palestinian brothers. How will that new dynamic, do you think, work? Do you have any immediate reflections on that?
Thank you, Richard. I'll focus simply on the Israel issue and the strategic consequences of change in Egypt, because I think if we started addressing the wider picture, we'd be here all night. But my reading of Egypt's relations with Israel has always seen both sides having a very pragmatic view of that relationship, and that extends beyond the leadership to leadership relationship, well through the military and the intelligence services, and I find it resonates in various ways at the popular level. Yes, there's deep offence within Egypt at the way in which Israel has conducted its relations or its dealings with the Palestinians. Egyptians feel humiliated on behalf of the Palestinians when they see what happened in Gaza and so on. But at the same time, Egyptians are quite ambivalent about what should be their contribution to the Palestinian cause. And it has not, the Palestinian cause has certainly not been helped by circumstances in which elements within Gaza have unilaterally acted, on one famous occasion, the breakout from Gaza into Egypt, but also with the death of various Egyptian soldiers, or various Egyptian policemen, soldiers dressed as policemen, along the border area. There's also been a sense that the Palestinians have been quick to demand support from Egypt, but slow to respond to Egyptian initiatives. For example, the Egyptian efforts to achieve a reconciliation between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And so there is a rather, as I say, an ambivalent understanding of just what Egypt's responsibilities are toward Israel, towards the Palestinians. The other thing which is absolutely hardwired into the Egyptian approach to the Gaza issue is that they will not become the outlet for Israel's occupation of Gaza. From their perception, and they argue this is in international law as well as a political matter, they want Israel to be held accountable for the restrictions that Israel imposes upon the movement, entry and egress of Palestinians from Gaza. And for Egypt to start to open its border would, from the Egyptian perspective, simply make the Israelis even more restrictive in their approach. Whereas from an Egyptian perspective, they want to see a coherent Palestinian entity emerge, which combines the Gaza and the West Bank into a viable political framework which can deal as a confident, strong entity with Israel to arrive at a peaceful outcome to the dispute.
Hi, Dr. Bowker. Thank you for your insights today. I'm an undergraduate student, and keeping with the theme of International Women's Day today, I was interested that you talked about the importance of empowerment of the Arab people and the perhaps neo-traditional values of the Arab street. Given this, what kind of potential is there for the development of quite a conservative coalition government and potentially a conservative constitution? And what might the potential effects be for Arab women and therefore possibly the changing Western response to the situation in Egypt?
That's a very good question. Certainly the conservative side of Egyptian politics, be it the remnants of the National Democratic Party and the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood, have a very strong interest in ensuring that the framework of the political debate protects the values that they regard as important for Egypt's identity. And they will have a lot of popular support for that. Egyptians are the most religious or the most devout of Arab countries that one might ever encounter. Indeed, there's good polling evidence to suggest that I think 72% of young Egyptians believe that religious values should play an important part in their lives, compared to only 38% of Syrians, or 42% of the Arab League average. Egyptians care about their religion, and any efforts to challenge what people regard as consistent with religious obligation will encounter difficulties, not only from the Brotherhood but also from the secular side of Egyptian society. However, while saying that, there is also a strong determination on the part of young Egyptians to be modern as well as religiously correct in their dress and demeanour. And that's an issue which Egyptians will work through for themselves. But the forces of time and the notion of what it means to be modern are working on the side of the reformists, not on the side of those who would try to hold back the tide. And as I was saying earlier, both Muslim and secular Egyptians have suddenly found how much they have in common. And I suspect they will be inclined to work through those issues together to a much greater extent now that they have seen that change is possible.
Okay, that will be the last question. Thank you.
In response to that point you were just making, and the comments you've made with regard to educated youth and the religious factor, which you said was 72% of the Egyptians feel strongly about their religion. To what extent are young women going to be able to participate as educated youth in being educated and perhaps being able to take a much more vigorous role in Egyptian events over the next 10, 20 or 30 years through that education?
One of the most compelling images of the entire revolution, it was compelling because it was quite long as well, was a young lady in hijab haranguing the crowd about the need for calling on the Ministry of the Interior to come down, you cowards. And well, she actually did it in a poem, which was terrific. Her performance, I think, was a pretty good indication of just how effective, how committed, how mobilised young Egyptian women have become. But even when we would meet as ambassadors Egyptian women journalists or artists and so on, the same sense that they had a voice and they expected it to be respected was very strong, and that is something that is not going to be turned back. No matter how patriarchal, traditional village society is in Egypt, young women are going off to work in factories, they're getting wage-based employment, they are demanding the right to go to university. Among middle-class women, they are demanding the right to travel. And in an increasing number of cases, we are finding women insisting upon marriage contracts which reflect their right to a career and to be an equal partner within the marriage. All these things are signs that there is a value being attached in Egypt by women to their own role in that society, and they are not going to let it be wound back.
I know there are a lot of questions, but look, that would definitely be the last one. No, the lady next to you. Yes. No, you.
It's Women's Day. It's women.
Oh, you are acting on his behalf, are you? Very interesting.
Given the fall of Egypt, Tunisia and possibly Yemen, do you see this as a sign of receding American influence in the region?
I think the American influence in the region has always been somewhat overstated. It depends very much on you have to look at it on an issue-by-issue basis. And at the social level, at the political level, there's not much evidence that the United States has been in a position to shape domestic political outcomes in any Arab country. It's part of the popular imagination that if the Americans wanted to do it, they could do it. But I've never seen the evidence that on things that really matter to my Arab friends, that an external party's views would be welcomed, let alone acted upon, unless there was some extraordinary situation in which those countries' assistance was needed, not their threats, but their assistance. As far as the regional security picture is concerned, I don't think there will be any loss of willingness on the part of governments be they secular or indeed Islamist, to work with the United States and others where threats to their own security are evident, and that includes in Yemen. But it will be no less true in whatever government emerges in Egypt or in Tunisia. There is room for cooperation. It will be harder because governments are going to be expected to be more consultative of popular opinion. They're going to need to explain why certain compromises need to be made. And that's a good thing, but it's what we must expect as a result of a process that we should be applauding.
You must be exhausted. Oh. Look, I personally like to share the optimism of His Excellency and Bob about the future of Egypt and the future of the region. But I was born as a pessimist, and I tend to lean towards Joe and lies, saying it's too soon to tell. Of course, the Middle East has proved to be one of the most unpredictable regions in the world, and the revolutions have been betrayed in the past, and revolutions have been misguided in the past. Revolutions have failed in the past. But let's hope that in the case of the Arab world, this will be a revolution which will bring about the genuine structural changes which that part of the world and the people really want, but they haven't experienced it for a long time. Bob, thank you very much for that excellent talk. Normally, we give a little gift to our speakers, but because you're a member of our staff, the best we can do is to give you our admiration. Thank you very much.